If you're confused about why the economy feels so different right now, why your mortgage costs twice what it did 3 years ago, or why, despite everyone saying we avoided a recession, things still feel tight, you're not alone. And before we dive deep into understanding what's really happening, I want to ask you something. If you find value in this explanation, if it helps you make better decisions about your money, your investments, or your business, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. This kind of economic education should be accessible to everyone, and your subscription helps us reach more people who need to understand these concepts. All right, let's dive in. Right now, we're living through one of the most fascinating economic moments in modern history. The Federal Reserve has engineered something remarkable. Interest rates sit at 3.5 to 3.75% as of December 2025, down from their peak, but still elevated by historical standards. To understand why this matters and where we're headed, we need to understand how the economic machine actually works. And nobody has explained this better than Ray Dalio, the legendary investor who predicted both the 2008 financial crisis and the 2011 European debt crisis by understanding these exact principles. The economy at its core is not some mysterious force that economists argue about in ivory towers. It's a machine, a relatively simple machine that operates on predictable principles. And once you understand these principles, you can see patterns that others miss. You can anticipate changes before they happen. You can protect yourself and even profit when others are caught off guard. Let's start with the absolute foundation. The economy is nothing more than the sum of all transactions happening within it. Every single day, millions of transactions occur. You buy coffee. A company purchases equipment. The government pays salaries. Each transaction involves a buyer exchanging money or credit with a seller for goods, services, or financial assets. It sounds almost too simple, but this is the building block of everything. Now, here's where it gets interesting. There are different players in this game, and the biggest spender of all is the government. The government spending dwarfs everyone else's. And when you understand this, you understand why government policy has such an outsized impact on your daily life. But the government isn't acting alone. The central bank in the United States, that's the Federal Reserve, controls something incredibly powerful. It controls how much money exists in the economy and what it costs to borrow that money. That cost is the interest rate. Think about what money really is in our modern economy. When Ray Dalio made his famous video explaining the economic machine, he pointed out something shocking. Of the $53 trillion in the US economy at that time, only $3 trillion was actual money. The other $50 trillion was credit, debt. These are two sides of the same coin. When you borrow money, you create debt for yourself and credit for the lender. It's an asset for them, a liability for you. And here's the crucial part that most people miss. Credit is created out of thin air. When a bank gives you a loan, they're not handing you someone else's savings. They're creating new purchasing power, new spending capacity that didn't exist before. This matters because credit is what makes our economy grow in the short term. Without credit, the only way to increase spending is to produce more. You'd have to work harder, innovate, become more productive, but with credit, you can spend more today, even if you haven't produced anything extra. You're essentially borrowing from your future self, borrowing from a version of you that will need to spend less than you make in order to pay back what you borrowed today. This creates something fundamental to understanding our current moment. It creates cycles. When you borrow, you can spend more than you produce, but eventually you have to pay it back, which means spending less than you produce. This swing from spending more to spending less, from expansion to contraction, this is what creates the economic cycles we all feel, but most people don't truly understand. Ray Dalio identified three main forces that drive the economy. First is productivity growth. This is the long-term trend, the line that moves steadily upward over time as we learn, innovate, and become more efficient. Productivity is what actually matters in the long run. It's why your great-grandchildren will likely have a higher standard of living than you do, just as you have a higher standard of living than your great-grandparents. But productivity growth is steady. It doesn't fluctuate wildly. It's not what causes the economic swings that dominate the news and impact your paycheck. What causes those swings are the other two forces, the short-term debt cycle and the long-term debt cycle. The short-term debt cycle lasts 5 to 8 years. You've experienced several of these in your lifetime, though you might not have recognized them as cycles. This cycle is primarily controlled by the central bank through interest rates. Here's how it works. In an expansion, economic activity increases. People are spending, businesses are hiring, optimism is high. This increased spending means increased income for others, which makes them more creditworthy. Banks are willing to lend more. People can borrow more. They spend more. That spending becomes someone else's income. It's a self-reinforcing cycle upward. But there's a problem. As this expansion continues, prices start rising faster than the central bank wants. We call this inflation. When you're going to buy groceries and notice that your cart costs 30% more than it did 3 years ago, that's inflation. When inflation rises too much, the central bank steps in, they raise interest rates. And this is exactly what happened starting in 2022. When interest rates rise, borrowing becomes more expensive. People have to spend more money on debt payments, which means they have less money to spend on everything else. Since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes start to fall. Economic activity slows. We call this a recession. If the recession becomes too severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank lowers interest rates again, making borrowing cheaper, allowing the cycle to restart. This is the short-term debt cycle, and it's happened over and over throughout modern economic history. The Federal Reserve raises rates to cool inflation. The economy slows. They lower rates to stimulate growth. The economy expands again. 5 to 8 years over and over. But there's a bigger cycle happening underneath, one that most people never see because it takes so long to play out. This is the long-term debt cycle, and it typically lasts 75 to 100 years. We're living in a critical phase of this cycle right now. Here's what happens. At the end of each short-term cycle, something subtle occurs. The economy ends up with more growth than before, but also with more debt than before. This is human nature. People love spending and borrowing more than they love paying back debt. It's natural to want to enjoy today and worry about tomorrow later. So over long periods of time, debt rises faster than income. At first, this seems fine. Debt is growing, but so is income. Asset prices are rising. Your home is worth more. Your stock portfolio is growing. You feel wealthier. Even though debt is increasing, it feels manageable because the value of everything you own is increasing too. Banks see you as creditworthy because you have assets to use as collateral. They're happy to lend you more money. You're happy to borrow it because you see your neighbor getting rich and you don't want to miss out. But here's where the machine starts to break down. At some point, debt repayments start growing faster than incomes. This happens gradually, then suddenly. People realize they're stretched too thin. They start cutting back on spending. They have to. Their debt payments are eating up too much of their income. And remember, one person's spending is another person's income. So when everyone starts cutting back at once, incomes fall across the economy. Now people feel poorer. Asset prices start to fall. The stock market drops. Real estate values decline. And this creates a vicious cycle. As asset prices fall, the collateral that borrowers put up against their loans is worth less. They become less creditworthy. Banks become nervous and stop lending. Credit disappears. Less spending means less income, means less wealth, means less credit, means less borrowing. Round and round, feeding on itself, spiraling downward. This is called a deleveraging, and it's different from a normal recession in a crucial way. In a recession, the central bank can lower interest rates to get things going again. But in a deleveraging, interest rates are already low. There's no room to cut them further. And even if there were, people don't want to borrow. They're too focused on paying down the debt they already have. Banks don't want to lend because they're scared of defaults. The normal mechanism that the central bank uses to restart the economy, lowering interest rates, it doesn't work anymore. This is what happened in 2008. This is what happened in the Great Depression. This is what Ray Dalio's template allowed him to predict when others couldn't see it coming. The United States went through a deleveraging from 2008 to around 2018. It was painful, it was slow, but we eventually worked through it. And then something extraordinary happened. The pandemic hit in 2020, and governments around the world did something unprecedented. They injected massive amounts of money into the economy. Stimulus checks, business loans, expanded unemployment benefits, trillions of dollars of new credit created seemingly overnight. In Ray Dalio's framework, this is called debt monetization. The government borrows money, and the central bank essentially prints money to buy that debt. It's one of the 4 tools available during a deleveraging, along with austerity, debt reduction, and wealth redistribution. This worked, in a sense. The economy didn't collapse, but it came with a cost. All that new money, all that new spending, it led to inflation. By 2022, inflation was running at levels not seen in 40 years. Prices for everything from gas to groceries to housing were soaring. The Federal Reserve had no choice. They had to raise interest rates, and fast. This brings us to our current moment, this high interest era we're living through. The Federal Reserve raised rates from near zero to over 5% in less than 2 years. It was one of the fastest rate hiking cycles in history. And now, as of December 2025, they've started cutting again, but slowly and cautiously. Rates currently sit at 3.5 to 3.75%. So what does this mean? What does Ray Dalio's framework tell us about where we're headed? This is where it gets really interesting and really important for your financial future. We're in a unique situation. We're simultaneously dealing with short-term debt cycle dynamics and long-term debt cycle concerns. The short-term picture shows an economy that's been remarkably resilient. Job growth has slowed but hasn't collapsed. Unemployment has ticked up slightly but remains relatively low. Inflation has come down from its peak but remains above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. Economic growth continues at a moderate pace. The Federal Reserve is trying to navigate what they call a soft landing. They want to slow the economy enough to bring inflation down without causing a recession. It's like trying to land an airplane on a moving ship during a storm. It requires perfect timing and a bit of luck. As of now, they seem to be pulling it off, but the landing isn't complete yet. The Fed's latest projections show they expect to make just one more rate cut in 2026 and another in 2027 before settling at a long-run target around 3%. This tells us something important. The era of near-zero interest rates that we got used to from 2008 through 2021, that era is over. We're returning to a more normal interest rate environment. 3 to 4% is not high by historical standards. It's actually quite normal. But if you're a millennial or younger, you've spent your entire adult life in an abnormal period of extraordinarily low rates. This feels high because it's all you've known. What does this mean practically? If you have a mortgage, especially if you locked in a rate below 3% during the pandemic, you have an incredibly valuable asset. Don't give it up lightly. If you're thinking about buying a home, understand that mortgage rates will likely stay elevated compared to what we saw from 2008 to 2021. Plan accordingly. Don't wait for rates to drop back to 3%. That's probably not happening anytime soon, if ever. If you're a saver, higher interest rates are actually good news. You can finally earn a real return on money market funds, certificates of deposit, and short-term bonds. For the first time in over a decade, being conservative with some portion of your money makes sense. If you're a business owner, the cost of capital is higher. Borrowing money to expand is more expensive. This means you need to be more disciplined about which projects you pursue. The easy money era, when investors were throwing cash at any idea that sounded promising, that's over. Now you need to show real profitability, real cash flow, real business fundamentals. But here's the bigger concern, the long-term debt cycle issue that keeps people like Ray Dalio up at night. The United States and most developed economies are carrying historically high levels of debt. Government debt has exploded. In Dalio's recent work, he's been sounding the alarm about what he calls the big debt cycle. He's warning that the U.S. could face a debt crisis if we don't change course. The problem is simple math. Government debt is growing faster than the economy. That's unsustainable. Eventually, something has to give. Either the government has to cut spending dramatically, raise taxes substantially, or allow inflation to erode the real value of the debt. None of these options are painless. All of them have significant consequences. In his recent book, Ray Dalio has proposed what he calls the 3% solution. Cut government spending by 3%, cut taxes by 3%, and invest an additional 3% in productivity-enhancing initiatives. The idea is to grow our way out of the debt problem rather than inflating or defaulting our way out. It's a beautiful deleveraging approach applied at the national level. A beautiful deleveraging in Dalio's framework is when debts decline relative to income growth, real economic growth is positive, and inflation isn't a problem. It's beautiful because it's balanced. You're reducing the debt burden without causing a depression, without destroying savings through hyperinflation, without creating social upheaval through massive wealth redistribution. The opposite is an ugly deleveraging. That's what Germany experienced in the 1920s when hyperinflation destroyed the currency and people's life savings. That's what Greece experienced after the 2008 crisis with crushing austerity that led to social unrest. That's what we want to avoid. So where does this leave us? How should you think about navigating the economic machine in this high interest era? First, understand that we're in a transition period. We're moving from an era of extraordinarily loose money to a more normal environment. This transition is bumpy. There will be volatility. There will be uncertainty. The Federal Reserve itself is divided about the right path forward. For the first time in years, we're seeing multiple dissents at Fed meetings, with members disagreeing about whether to cut rates, hold steady, or even raise them further. This lack of consensus makes the path forward less predictable. Second, recognize that productivity is what matters in the long run. Countries that invest in education, infrastructure, technology, and innovation will prosper. Those that don't will fall behind. As an individual, this means continuously investing in your own skills and knowledge. The productivity growth line is the only thing that matters over decades. Third, be mindful of debt. Ray Dalio's first rule of thumb is don't have debt rise faster than income. This applies to individuals just as much as countries. If you're taking on debt, make sure it's for things that increase your productive capacity. Student loans that lead to higher earnings, a mortgage on a home you can afford, a business loan to expand a profitable operation, these can make sense. Credit card debt to fund consumption, car loans for vehicles you can't really afford, these are traps. Fourth, don't have income rise faster than productivity. This sounds strange, but it's about competitiveness. If you're getting paid more but not producing more value, eventually that catches up with you. Companies that pay employees more than the value they create eventually go bankrupt. Countries that do this become uncompetitive in the global economy. Make sure you're earning what you're paid by creating real value. Fifth, and most important, do everything you can to raise your productivity. Learn new skills, adopt new technologies, work smarter, not just harder. This is what drives long-term prosperity, both for individuals and societies. The economic machine is predictable once you understand its mechanisms. Credit drives short-term cycles. Productivity drives long-term growth. The interaction between the two creates the world we live in. Right now, we're in a high-interest environment because we just went through a period of excess credit creation that led to inflation. The Federal Reserve is trying to normalize things to bring the system back to balance. The biggest risk we face isn't the short-term debt cycle. The Fed has shown they can manage that, though not perfectly. The biggest risk is the long-term debt cycle. If government debts continue to grow faster than the economy, if we don't address the structural imbalances, we could face a crisis that makes 2008 look mild by comparison. But here's the thing about understanding these cycles. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. You start recognizing the patterns. You anticipate the turns. You position yourself to benefit rather than suffer when changes come. That's what Ray Dalio did. That's what allowed him to profit while others panicked in 2008. You don't need to be a billionaire hedge fund manager to apply these principles. You just need to understand the machine and how it works. Understand that credit is borrowed spending from the future. Understand that what goes up must come down and vice versa. Understand that in the long run, Productivity is all that matters. Understand that debt is both necessary and dangerous, useful and destructive, depending on how it's used. We're living in a moment of transition. Interest rates are higher than they've been in over a decade, but lower than historical norms. Inflation is falling, but not yet fully under control. The economy is growing, but more slowly than before. Government debt is rising to dangerous levels, but not yet crisis levels. We're somewhere in between the extremes, trying to find balance. This is actually the most important time to understand these principles. It's not during the boom when everything is easy or during the bust when it's too late. It's now in the transition when understanding the machine gives you the biggest advantage. If you take nothing else from this, remember the three forces. Productivity growth is the long-term line that trends upward. The short-term debt cycle swings above and below that line every 5 to 8 years. And the long-term debt cycle, spanning 75 to 100 years, creates the major turning points in economic history. We just experienced a major turning point. The pandemic, the policy response, the inflation, the rate hikes, all of it represents a significant shift. We're not going back to the way things were from 2008 to 2021. That was the deleveraging era, the era of healing from the 2008 crisis. That healing is complete. Now we're in a new phase. Understanding where we are in these cycles, that's power. That's the difference between being blindsided by events and being prepared for them. That's the difference between making decisions based on hope and making them based on understanding. The economic machine works in predictable ways. It always has. It always will. The players change, the technologies change, but the fundamental mechanics remain the same. Credit expands, credit contracts, optimism builds, optimism fades, prices rise, prices fall. These cycles are as old as money itself. Ray Dalio spent his entire career studying these patterns, testing them against history, refining them through experience. His framework has proven accurate time and again because it's based on the fundamental mechanics of how the system actually works, not on hopeful assumptions about how it should work. You now understand more about the economic machine than most people will ever know. You understand why interest rates matter, how debt creates cycles, why inflation happens, what the Federal Reserve is trying to accomplish. More importantly, you understand where we are right now and where we're likely headed. Use this knowledge. Make better decisions. Protect yourself from the downside. Position yourself for the opportunities that always exist, even in challenging times. And remember, in the long run, productivity is what matters. Keep learning, keep growing, keep creating value. That's the one thing that never goes out of style, no matter where we are in the cycle. The economic machine keeps turning. The question is whether you'll understand it well enough to turn with it, or whether you'll be caught off guard when it shifts. You now have the framework. The rest is up to you.